A man sat huddled and slumped upon a jagged crimson throne within his dilapidated hall. The ceiling had long since collapsed, strewing rubble across its once ornate floors. The infinite sky of the otherworld peered through overhead, massive, unblinking eyes peering into the broken remnant of a once great palace. The colors of the souls and magical energies therein reflected off of the red-tinted marble and intermittent pools of rotting blood. The had-been lord mumbled to himself incoherently in a shrill and otherworldly voice. He wore tattered rags of once finely woven black and red silk that were no more than a skeleton of their former glory. Beads of sweat and blood covered the man's nearly bare body. His long black hair and unkempt beard were matted and clumped with dried blood. It was a pitiable state for any being who had once held claim to the title God. An apparition appeared in the center of the hall, a tall man with long, ornate robes that brushed his feet. The black hair atop his head was finely braided and tied at the back, wrapping around the imposing rack of white antlers that sprang from his skull above his ears, giving the resemblance of a crown. The rest of his hair flowed down his upper back in waves and over his shoulders like pitch-black water. Braids also held his beard together and close to his chest. He was majestic, a symbol of power and nobility. A true god. Two canine creatures with coats of white flame and burning red eyes and ears appeared beside him.
Oh, how the mighty have fallen.
The interloper spoke in a thunderous voice. The Lord of the Hall hissed through fanged teeth and rolled off of his throne onto the cold and broken stone. The energies in the miasma of magic around them seemed to naturally pull towards the new arrival, as if the souls themselves responded to their master's beck and call.
Trespasser,
the fallen lord croaked. The other man laughed deeply.
You are allowed dominion here by my grace and power. Do not forget that, Crom.
The beaten and bloodied creature recoiled at the name, as though its mere mention could hurt him. He slowly lifted his head and met the other man's gaze through his fallen hair.
What do you want with me, Otwin?
Crom spat with more force as he fought to regain his strength. Otwin stepped closer to the throne, his hounds close at heel.
The Eidolon is growing restless. It still searches for you, and has destroyed a number of holes on its rampage.
Crom looked around in frantic desperation, expecting the haunted creature to leap out at him from behind the rubble. His eyes eventually refocused on his guest.
I fail to see how that is my problem,
he hissed. Otwin smiled.
Release the tyrant, or deal with his pet. I don't care which, but if you do not put an end to this, I will.
Otwin's kind smile turned to cold fury as he spoke.
I doubt you will enjoy my solution,
he continued. One of his hounds stopped at a nearby puddle of blood and began to lap it up greedily. Crom sprang to his feet and rushed towards the beast, his own antlers deep red with dried blood sprouted from his head. One was broken off a few inches up, leaving little more than a spike, while the other reached through the air in a cruel grasp. The hound reared its head and backed away from the pool, its hackles raised, as Crom fell to the floor and began to drink ravenously from the puddle.
I see Dan is still in there after all,
Otwin said, noting his divine horns. Crom raised his eyes to him with hatred.
Fix this, Crom, or you may find the next cycle even less kind to you than this one.
With that remark, Otwin turned and called his hounds to heel. Then in a flash of light and color, he was gone. A chuckle from behind Crom broke his intense stare at where the God King previously stood. He whipped his head around and spun his body that was posed on all fours towards his shattered throne. A man sat there. A man that Crom recognized all too well. He was a near giant of a man with a closely shaven golden head. His olive skin and deep emerald oval eyes stood in stark contrast with the pale, dark, and crimson colors around them. His well-defined and square jaw quivered as his chuckle grew to a twisted laugh. Crom reached out and grabbed a broken chalice from the ground nearby and sent it hurtling towards the throne.
Get out of my head!
He screamed. The chalice clattered against the empty throne and fell to the ground below. The sound of the man's deep laughter still echoed in the air. Crom collapsed into a heap on the bloody floor, the last of his strength being drained from him. Between the sanguines and his zealots, he should have enough strength of soul to rival Otwin himself, but instead he lay here, weak and powerless. Fate was a cruel mistress. He couldn't care less about what the Eidolon did to the other gods and their lands, but he needed to be free from this curse. The Lord of Chaos and God of Blood would bow to neither mortal nor god. He just needed a little more power, and the worlds would yet still burn. Akron Audio presents, in association with Weeb Digital, Blood and Shadows, Part 2, written and directed by James Victor. I hope that you will enjoy this story. If you do, please leave a like and a comment. I would really appreciate it. To stay up to date on when new stories are released, feel free to subscribe and click the notification bell. Without further ado, I implore that you listen and enjoy. Chapter 1. The old man, who had forgotten his own name long ago, walked the cramped streets of Eldaruun. The sprawling megalopolis was a gleaming tribute to mortal unity and ingenuity, and a testament to Brokken's order. It disgusted the old man. But even here he was able to see the chaos roiling beneath the surface. The filth looked up at him with reverence, his ragged cloak soaking up the refuse of the cobblestone streets. The higher inhabitants of the streets looked down on him in disgust. In their mind, to be revered by the dregs of society is to be even lower than the low. He was no king nor god. The respect he commanded was not intentional or even wanted. He was but a shepherd of the lowly, a servant of blood, the avatar of Crom, his herald, the lone survivor of the true zealots and the first sanguines. He was only of the third blood when he was originally turned, but Crom himself had raised him above lords, giving unto him a blessing of blood not even his first blood children possessed, making him his mouth and ears in the mortal world. He, of course, was subject to the madness as anyone, but his immortal blood outlasted even the strongest of the sanguines. He had guided the sanguines and the blood-brood zealots alike for centuries in Crom's name, leading Crom's chosen in faith and blood, doling out Crom's justice when needed, but he preferred a gentler hand. Crom was not a loving god, but his herald cared deeply for his people in his place. He walked through the streets, beneath the spires and towers threatening the otherworld, from shadow to shadow. He had been in search of Tatarin for years now, a Hemomancer of the fourth aspect who abandoned his calling and his right as a perfect sacrifice to Crom. It broke his heart to see Tatarin turn from his responsibility, but he understood. He was young and full of promise and potential. It was almost a shame to give that to Crom before he even had a chance to live. Crom needed his strength now more than ever, but perhaps in a different way. He found it more and more difficult to commune with Crom in the past century, but he was able to appeal to him long enough to intercede on Tatarin's behalf. The god of blood and lord of chaos could be merciful when given the right incentives. The feeling was faint. The strength of Tatarin's soul was impressive, but there were ways of hiding it, even from those with soul sight. Though the boy was not hiding from him anymore. Something far worse had happened to him. He knew he was close, however. He had to be. He was nearing the outer reaches of the vast cityscape. A small and humble stone structure stuck out to him on the street. It was rudimentary and separated from the nearby buildings, all of the telltale signs of a safe house. He smiled to himself, then crossed the street towards the unassuming building. Tatarin sat chained to a small chair in the center of the cold stone room, as he had every day for what felt like years. The investigator named Martonus claimed it had only been a few weeks at this point. But that thing... The amount of pain and torment he had endured at the hands of Martonus's monster was more than anyone could endure in a century, much less a few weeks. His mouth and throat were dry, his breaths ragged. Martonus had kept him alive, but barely. Just not enough water for him to live, just not enough food for him to starve. He had forced him to burn nearly every soul he had ever consumed, just to keep breathing. Years and years of blood sacrifices wasted. Countless souls burned just to sate his own thirst. He had burned them all but one. The first soul he ever took, the soul that meant everything to him, the soul of his mother. He had burned through most of it that first night he tapped into his power in order to save what was left of his village, but he still held a drop of her blood that contained all that was left of her, a drop that would never belong to Crom. He made her a promise. Tatarin heard the door outside his dingy cell creak open. He hadn't expected his jailer to return for several more hours. Despite the emptiness of time when Martonus was gone, he cherished every moment he was free of the terrible creature inside that man's head. He readied himself and his mind, and waited for the horror that he would be forced to endure yet again. However, instead of a key unlocking his cell door from the outside, he heard a trickle of liquid, and then the door itself was blown off of its hinges, rotating on the lock and ripping it along with chunks of stone and wood out of the wall. He coughed and winced as he was covered in dust and pelted with rubble. A lone figure emerged from the doorway, covered in a tattered patchwork cloak. The man lowered his weathered hood and revealed the face of the one man he feared more than Martonus and his reaper, the Herald of Crom. As terrible as his captors were, at least they wanted him alive. The same could not be said for this man. He once would have said that he loved this man like a father. All that was left of that time was now memory.
"Hello, Tatarin,"
the older man said in a kindly voice.
"Herald,"
he croaked through dry and scratched lungs.
"It's good to see you, child. It's been too long."
"Not long enough."
The herald sighed deeply and walked further into the room, crouching down in front of his former protege, a pained expression on his face.
"I'm sorry, Tatarin. I thought you would be the one to lead us from this tortured place, into the blood halls. But fate chose differently."
"You chose differently."
He spat.
"I did. And I have chosen differently once again."
He stood up and walked behind Tatarin, placing his hands atop his shoulders.
Crom is not pleased with you, child. You denied him power when he was in great need of it. However, he is preoccupied as of late and is unable to hunt you down as he normally would.
"Which is why you're here."
"No. I pleaded with the Great Lord on your behalf, begged for mercy. He's not currently in a place to disagree with me or deny my requests. He's given me a task for you to complete. In exchange for your life, you must swear to submit yourself to Crom willingly once this is over."
"So I die either way."
"Would you rather stay here? To be tortured for eternity by that cursed creature?"
Tatarin pondered for a moment. He didn't want to die. He didn't want to serve Crom. But even more, he wanted to be free from this hellish place.
"No,"
he whispered.
"I'll do it."
"Swear it."
The herald resumed his position in front of Tatarin.
"I swear."
"A blood oath, Tatarin. I will not have you betray your responsibilities again."
Tatarin's head fell, defeated. Thoughts of his mother welled up from within him.
"Wait. Please. My mother."
The herald froze.
You've held on to her all this time, haven't you?"
"I couldn't let go. Please help me free her. It was her last request."
The herald thought long and hard. Tatarin knew that what he was asking for was blasphemous, but he didn't care.
"Her request is heresy. But she was a great woman, a great leader, and a dear friend. I will grant you this request, Tatarin.
He knelt forward and placed his hand caringly on Tatarin's face.
Release her, child. It's time.
It took every last ounce of Tatarin's strength to reach into the depths of his soul. He felt his blood dance and come alive as he drew out the last fragments of the woman who had meant everything to him. Her power reacted with his own. For a moment, he could hear the chaotic harmonies of the universe flow together. It was beautiful. If he had tears left to cry, he was sure they would be flowing now. But instead, a single drop of blood pooled at the corner of his eye. Beautiful, powerful blood. That single drop may have been enough to free him from his bonds and torment. But he knew he never could have burned it, no matter the cost. It slid down his face, trailing a mother's warmth behind it. The herald reached his finger to it, and it leapt from Tatarin's face to the older man's hand. He held that drop of blood with the reverence that it deserved. He closed his eyes, and the drop fell away from his finger and levitated in the space between his outstretched hands. Crom had given his herald the power to transfer souls to the otherworld, so that he could make sacrifices directly to him. But that power also allowed him to release souls into the wild current of energy that flowed freely throughout the otherworld. The drop of blood glowed brightly and cast the whole room in red, then white. Then, it was gone. Another note added to the otherworld's discordant melody. She was free now, from the mortal world and from Crom. A sharp pain pierced Tatarin's arm, and another stream of blood rose from his flesh as the herald sliced his skin with a dagger he had not seen. He then sliced his own arm and merged their blood in front of them.
Do you swear to uphold the promise you made to Crom? On threat of your life and risk of your soul?
I do.
Tatarin answered, still drained both physically and emotionally. The blood separated once more and re-entered their respective arms.
Then you are bound,
the herald said, rising to his feet and shattering the bonds that held Tatarin to his chair with a flick of his hand.
Come, child of blood. There is work to be done.
The walls of intertwined trees that wrapped around the city of Greatwood were deep green in the stormy air, the kind of green that was so vibrant it made you question whether you had ever seen the color before. Something about a storm always brought the color out of the world, just before it cast it into shadow. The storm itself was still a few hours out, but its forward scouts of showers and harsh winds still soaked Elenshia to her core. The journey from Eldaroon to Greatwood was unpleasant on the best of days, made all the worse by having to ride in the back of a rickety grain cart pulled by filthy Beshan work boars. The size of bears, the smell of pigs, and the attitude of mules. The Woden sure did all they could to make the creatures as detestable and unlikable as possible. But they were stronger than 2 bulls each, so she supposed she could see the practical use for them. 3 weeks had passed since the bloodbath that had destroyed her life and taken the only thing of value she ever had, her soul. 3 weeks of traveling towards Greatwood, the largest Elken enclave across the spheres. 3 weeks of walking, sailing, riding, and dreading every step she took closer. She felt like a child who had run away only to return home, humbled and empty-handed. But she was not a child, and Greatwood was not her home. Despite the ever-increasing pit in her stomach, seeing Greatwood's living walls stretching into the sky always filled her with wonder and almost a sense of pride in the Elken. It was the greatest thing the Elken had ever constructed, and probably ever would. But she was Elken in name only. Her people, the Forgorn, had long since cast aside their racial markers and foolish ideologies. She would not be welcomed here with open arms. But she would be welcomed. She pulled her oversized hood close around her head, trying in vain to shield herself from the rain for the few minutes before they entered under Greatwood's canopy. A month ago, she would have simply placed a repelling ward over her head to keep herself perfectly dry. Then again, a month ago, she wouldn't be riding in the back of a grain cart either. For having lost her reason to live, she thought she had handled things rather well, though much of that may be owed to denial, or false hope that her people could heal her burnt-out soul. This, of course, was impossible. People had tried for eons to heal the soulless, but to no avail. Not without direct intervention from a god, that is, which was only recorded happening once, and no Woden god would ever heal the soul of a Forgorn. On the bright side, she would likely live a few decades longer than most Elken, since she wouldn't have to worry about the madness anymore, and her nights would be dreamless and restful. The only benefits of being powerless in a world of gods, monsters, and magic. They entered through the wide gates of the great city, and under its welcoming canopy. Greatwood was once nothing more than a forest, belonging to one of the most powerful Elken clans. But after the Brokken Empire rose to power, many other clans fled here seeking refuge. It was the first time in thousands of years where the Elken were unified with a common goal: stopping the advance of Brokken. They raised the living wall and turned the forest into a metropolis. Large buildings made from magically shaped stone and wood spread out in tiered rings that rose towards the canopy overhead. Together, the people of Greatwood held off Brokken's siege for a year and a day before he broke through. Seeing their unity and ferocity, he gained a respect for the inhabitants that he did not have for the rest of their kind, and offered them diplomacy instead of subjugation. They wisely accepted. Despite their uneasy treaty with the Empire, they, like all Elken, never accepted Lord Brokken as a god after his apotheosis. The Empire wanted to break the treaty during the Second Unification War, but without Brokken's direct leadership, they knew they wouldn't stand a chance. So they settled for the rest of the mortal world. Other than the island nations of Sedek, they were the only independent city-state in all the spheres at the end of the Second Unification War, another fact that nearly filled Elenshia with pride. Nearly. She dismounted the cart and paid the poor farmer who had offered her passage with what little coin she had left, without so much as a word. Such a small amount used to be nothing to her, but it would likely feed this man and his family for a week. It also could have fed her for a week. Unlike him, however, she was Elken. Under the tenets of one Woden god or another, she would be able to find some faithful follower willing to support her during her stay. Of course, she didn't intend to stay long, and she also didn't like to rely on her heritage for anything. Like all the Forgorn, their Elken ancestry was cause for great shame, and little else. She moved through the crowd like a wraith, unseen, unnoticed, unfelt. She would be invisible to anyone using magic or soulsight. Another benefit of her curse, she supposed. On the other hand, she had never moved through such a crowd without touching their souls as well. It was an involuntary thing that all beings did subconsciously. When in groups of people, your life feeds off of their life, their energy, as they feed off of yours. The result is growth and harmony. You feel part of something greater. Now, even in this crowded street, she felt utterly and completely alone. She felt nothing. No one, no life, no energy. She waded through the river of would-be corpses towards the massive tree positioned in the center of the city. Ringed structures circled it in tiers. Within the center of that tree was the Hengegate, an artifact left over from when the Woden still walked the mortal world. A circle of enchanted standing stones capable of facilitating travel between the spheres. Only a few of them were left standing and operational. Even fewer were still controlled by the Elken. The crowd was suffocating as she moved through the throng. She all but disappeared beneath the web of tall antlers. She passed by ivory towers and beneath stone arches, gazing up to the glowing green canopy overhead. Elken from every clan on nearly every sphere melted together here. They all kept their distance outside of Greatwood. Many of them would even be in near open war elsewhere. But here, they were all simply Elken, children of the gods. She knew that she wouldn't be granted passage during a storm, but she wanted to scout out the Hengegate. This was the first time since she came to Apis that she had been to Greatwood. and that was over 100 years ago. More than a full human lifetime. She worked her way through the city and entered under the first ring of the great tree that had grown atop the Hengegate. A large crowd had gathered at its entry. She made it nearly to the front of the shifting mass before the passage to the gate closed off. She had expected as much during the storm, but the gathering of other Elken, as if they expected to get in, surprised her. She had already turned and walked back into the crowd when a voice called out,
Elshia ilwodeni.
She spun around to see an elder Elken in the final stanza of his life, the Gatekeeper. The golden embroidery stood out starkly on his gray robes. The intricate patterns of vines and leaves noted his station well.
That is not my name.
She said coldly.
Your name is Heresy.
Then I wear it with pride. Elenshia, 2 lyrics, not 3. Use respect when accusing me of heresy.
The Gatekeeper chuckled.
I'm surprised you remember me after all this time.
Foregone rarely come to Greatwood, and I never forget a face.
What do you want, Gatekeeper?
You're supposed to be dead.
I've never been good at doing what I'm supposed to.
Your kind never were. The gate is closed to you, Elshia ilwodeni.
She took a step closer to him, rage and indignation rising from within her.
What right do you have to deny any Elken passage?
It is my right as the Gatekeeper to deny the request of anyone. It is not strictly personal. The way between spheres has been treacherous at late. The gate has been closed to all in the past weeks, until travel is safer. Your soul is burned. You no longer hold the authority of Brokken. Otherwise you would not be here. You will wait like everyone else.
She clenched her fist, raised her chin, and spun on her heels.
Goodbye, Gatekeeper.
She moved back through the flood of people, numb to their souls, their energy, numb to the world itself. Her soul laid bare. But then, for the first time since the bloodbath, she felt something. Her eyes followed the feeling that rose within her, and she glanced at a small figure clad in black that disappeared from sight. Martonus stood in front of the grim statue of the betrayer, the massive human skeleton cast from steel. The skeletal form was impaled on a spike, with his hands downstretched. It was a symbol of the Church of Brokken, a figure even more important to Brokken's mythos than Crom. He was one of Brokken's chosen companions during the First Unification War, before his Apotheosis. It was said that on the eve of the Empire's founding, he was betrayed by his closest ally. A seed of chaos planted in the hearts of men grew as a weed to strangle order's bloom. Or so the saying went. Martonus and the Ministry knew the truth of what the betrayer did, but truths like that served no one. Brokken's order was established on the betrayer's bones. The truth was irrelevant. A voice behind Martonus brought him out of his quiet contemplation.
The Rector will see you now,
the young boy said.
Wonderful,
Martonus replied. He turned and followed the boy through a doorway in the large sanctuary. Faint memories of the last time he stood in a building like this marched around the outskirts of his mind. He had forgotten the specifics, but he remembered the death, the pain. That seemed to be all he remembered these days. He had come to the rectory seeking information about a particularly devious type of Faeden, rumored to be at large in Eldaroon. Karna were rare, mostly because they were one of the hardest to detect, and they rarely caused problems on a large scale. Their curse was simple. The Faeden itself would latch onto a person's soul, and over time consume and replace it, until only the strange, broken, and twisted soul of the Faeden remained. However, during this process, the Faeden would adopt the characteristics and mannerisms of the host to perfection, leaving the Fakehurst being indistinguishable from the original. The issue would arise after the host died. The Karna is then forcibly ejected back into the Veil, where their Faeden soul would deteriorate and die unless they possessed another host in quick succession. The Karna would then have all the memories and mannerisms of the original host, but forced into a new body. After a number of such possessions, what's left of the Faeden soul would be so broken and confused that any they possessed would go mad in short order. Unfortunately, many throughout history have considered Karna as a form of true rebirth, and consider it a blessing of their god when it occurs. Martonus had yet to encounter this Karna, but rumors were spreading about a man who was chosen by Brokken, and whose soul was immortal. He was skeptical at first, but after this chosen proclaimed himself a prophet and started killing himself in ritualistic sacrifice to pass on his blessing and prove his divinity, things became a little more serious in Martonus' mind. The boy led him to the Rector's office, where a young man with tan skin and orange eyes sat behind a sturdy steel desk. He looked to be of Purican descent, which he noted as being rare for an Apache Rector, but not unheard of. He wore the traditional gray robes and white stole of a man in his position. Martonus sat himself in the chair across the desk from the younger man.
How can I help you, Inspector?
The High Seat of the Church called for the aid of the Ministry of Investigation in a situation involving one prophet of Brokken. I am answering that call.
Martonus hated formalities, but events such as these, which called for cooperation between the branches of Brokken's empire, lived and died on the altar of such things. The Rector sighed deeply.
We have tried to condemn these beliefs as heresy, of course, but the people have grown more and more restless every passing year. I think they long to feel Brokken's hands on the world once more, as much as his faithful servants.
He stood up and paced, clearly disturbed by the strange situation.
It's a very delicate situation, you understand. If the Church were to take action against these dissenters, it could very well create martyrs and even more fervent and zealous believers. The Church has always been the intercessor for the people. But if the people turned against us, there would be chaos.
He spat the last word as if it were poison. To many in the Brokken Empire, it was.
Where is this prophet functioning out of? Who are his supporters?
The West District of Cossentor Quarter. Many of his supporters are of the lower classes and families, but he has also gathered the support of a number of nobles, including several that have ties to the city guard.
He stopped pacing and turned to look at Martonus, rubbing his stole between his fingers.
I do not know if these nobles support out of belief or simply because they wish to gain leverage over the people and the Church, but the governors have refused to get involved.
I understand.
Martonus stood to leave when he was struck by a searing pain in his soul. He felt a roiling mass of shadow stir and churn as it fought for control over his mind and body. He collapsed back into the chair, and the Rector reached towards him.
Are you all right, Investigator?
His mind swirled and his body trembled under the oppressive weight of the creature within him.
Kill the rat, the blood.
The ungodly entity screamed from within the depths of his very being. His vision blurred and red streaks battled at the corners of his sight.
Stay back,
he mumbled to the Rector. The Rector withdrew his hand and backed several steps away.
Now is not a good time, Reaper.
Martonus hissed through gritted teeth. The past few weeks had been hard on Reaper. Between his constant torturing of the Hemomancer and Martonus' own impending madness, it had all taken a costly toll on the Faeden. Sometimes he would writhe about in his mind, trying to seize control. Others he would remain completely silent for days at a time. Martonus felt the effects too, of course. His mind slipped further and further away from him every day. Every night he dreamed of his past and awoke never to remember those things again. The madness, they called it. The curse of those who lived too long. Unfortunately for everyone else, this particular madman also had a murderous Faeden trapped in his head that would happily take over his body once his mind inevitably crumpled to ash.
The rat escaped.
Martonus' stomach felt as if it would climb into his throat. Tatarin, the rat, as Reaper called it, had escaped. Martonus could hardly think of worse news. It took nearly every ounce of power both he and Reaper had to imprison him in the first place, And that was after he had left a gruesome bloodbath in his wake, with corpses piled high. He should have just killed the wretch when he had the chance. Part of Martonus hoped that Reaper was wrong. Maybe he made a mistake. But Reaper was a hunter, a killer. The traps and triggers he placed around the boy's cell would not fail. Martonus struggled to his feet and pushed out of the Rector's office without a goodbye, and slowly worked his way outside of the building. The air in the city could hardly be called fresh, but it was cool.
Reaper, talk to me.
Blood. Kill the rat.
Reaper, calm down.
The pain pounding in his head, his heart, his very being was excruciating. The red at the corners of his eyes reluctantly receded, and his heart resumed its normal rate.
Keeper, I'm sorry.
The creature screamed in mournful agony.
Apologize later. What happened?
The alarms, they were triggered by blood, but not from the boy.
Blood of Crom.
He swore, then ran down a cobbled side street towards the outer city.